of where they were at with understanding HIV in their community, what types of programs and interventions might be necessary in the community. They had talked about the fact that in the early mid-1990s, they'd had a fairly large program and conference in their community around HIV, but since that time, they'd really hadn't focused very much attention on HIV. So at that time, we we reached out to REACH, and they provided funding for us to do a community readiness assessment. And we used the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, which is now the Canadian Alliances and Networks. We used their manual, their workbook, to guide us through a community readiness assessment. And as a result of that process, the community identified the need for a more succinct step-by-step workbook that would help them do an assessment and repeat an assessment from year to year or from time to time when they were ready to review where they were at with HIV. So we worked with the community and came up with a draft workbook that we presented at one of the CINetwork events, the Manitoba HIV Collective Impact Network events. And at that time in 2020, we were ready to pilot the workbook with 5 First Nations communities. And then COVID struck. So we took a step back and we decided that we would work with Vincent Design to make the workbook look really good and appropriate, and make it usable. So over the last year and a half, we've worked with Vincent Design to come up with this finished product that we're ready to launch to communities who are wanting to do a readiness assessment. So the need for a community readiness assessment for initiating change. There are lots of existing HIV programs and interventions available, but they're not all necessarily appropriate for all First Nations communities. And before those programs or interventions are put into place, it is often a question, a point of reflection and review about where a community is at and what strategies they might feel are appropriate for the community to participate in or to champion over the next years. And the workbook is designed to help communities review what they've done in terms of HIV programming and interventions, where what the community brings to the table in terms of their strengths and resources, and what sorts of challenges might exist in the community that would be somewhat of barriers for creating change in the community. So the workbook is designed to help the community ask the questions about where they're at with HIV and what are the facilitators and what the barriers are for helping them to move forward for creating change. Oopsie. So basically, it's a step-by-step workbook that we've created. It has five steps, from preparation to conducting interviews, reviewing the responses to the interviews, developing an action plan, and then reviewing and evaluating the implementation of that action plan. The questions and the information that are collected through the interviews are based on 5 themes: community services for responding to HIV, the leadership, what the leadership looks like with regards to HIV in the community, what the community climate is for responding to HIV, knowledge about HIV and the types of resources that are present in the community for responding to HIV. Vincent Design is an Indigenous-led graphic design company, and they were super resourceful and helpful in creating a workbook that reflects the ideology and the sentiments, the background, and the, the the feeling that we wanted to convey with this workbook. So just these are images from the pages from the workbook, and I'll just take you briefly through the 5 steps, just to give you a flavor of the fact that we wanted to make this a community-based, easy, step-by-step process that is well described in this workbook and has all the tools and the descriptions of what to do, so that anyone in the community can work through this book. So step 1 is basically bringing a group of up to 5 people together to identify that there's a need to use this workbook and to undertake this work. The interviewers, you might have up to 5 interviewers in your group, and each of those interviewers are going to interview one person from the community. And all of these tools, we call them, these guides for setting up the plans and the activities, are included in the workbook. So basically you need a group of 5 people who have identified this as something that is required in the community. And you fill in the workbook, the work pages are there handy for each person to keep track of. So step 1 is allocating the interviews and bringing the group together to conduct the interviews. Step 2 is actually conducting the interviews. So the workbook contains the pages that have the interview questions on them. It tells you that you can have the interviews of 1 or 2 people per interview. There's 20 questions, and the questions are given in the workbook, and then there's space for the interviewer to document the answer to the questions. So the question here, the very first question is how important is it for a community to have services to respond to HIV? And the person might respond, I think it's important. We've had activities for AIDS Awareness Week, and our senior high school students have had poster competitions about HIV as part of our health curriculum. So they've given an answer. They think it's important that we address this issue. And we've had a few activities in the communities about HIV. And it's just to get a sense of what's going on in the community and right, how aware people are in the community about HIV and STBBIs. So the next part is step 3 is actually, we call it scoring the responses, and it's not as objective as really it's led to indicate here. We give each of the responses a score based on a level of readiness, and all of this is included in the workbook. So this response, I scored it as about a 5, a level 5, where there are efforts and programs and activities in the communities, and efforts are being planned with regards to HIV in the community. And the number is to give a rough idea in terms of readiness. My screen just booted out sorry about that. The numbers are meant to give you a rough indication of the level of readiness. It's not meant to be exact. It's never going to be exact. It's very subjective and not as objective as we might think it could be. Sorry about that. So you're scoring each of the answers. There's 2 to 5 people get together to talk about what people are saying in the interviews. So you've got 5 interviews that you're reviewing with a group of people, and you're scoring them. And then the next step is bringing all those scores together and getting what we call a community readiness level. So this is just an example that's in the workbook, and the average of all the questions and all the scores turns out to be a 3. And there's a tool here in the workbook that tells you that 3 corresponds to the fact that your community probably has a vague awareness of HIV and a beginning recognition that it is a local problem. So, and these aren't meant to be uh, prescriptive or definitive. They're there as a way of thinking about what was given back to you in terms of the interviews. And these will help the community in terms of developing an action plan, which is the next step. So based on the score that in the example was a 3, so the community has a vague awareness, and we provide in this tool strategies for developing an action plan if your community is at a level 3, for example. And we also have strategies all the way from levels 1 up to 10. So the action plan here is to work with the community leaders and community planners to respond to the interviews and to respond to what you learned in the interviews and move that forward to an action plan. And then the next step is that you move from the action plan into a reassessment. So it's important that not only do you do this community assessment one time, but you take the time to come back to it after 6 months, after a year, and see what changes have been made in your community as a result of your efforts. It's important that there is this cycle so that change can be seen to happen and can be recognized and carried forward in the community. So the workbook has a section for evaluating the workbook. We asked, it's an online survey that is at the end of the workbook. It's only has 5 questions asking about the need for the workbook, whether the workbook's useful, the quality of the workbook, and what improvements might need to be made for the workbook. So that's just a rapid feedback assessment that's available in the workbook. But we're also looking to work with 5 communities to evaluate the workbook and evaluate the workbook in the process of conducting a community readiness assessment. So this would be a more in-depth analysis of the community-based workbook and the community-based initiative for change. We want to evaluate the outcomes and the change as a result of using the workbook. And if communities are interested in working with us, we'll assist with the implementation of the workbook and work with the community to basically work through the workbook and help them with strategies for planning for change, planning the action plan for the community, and revisiting that after a period of time. This is part of a larger CIHR funded initiative, which was the original intent of this workbook, to provide an intervention and assess this intervention, which is the workbook, and to understand its usefulness, its utility, and ways that we can help First Nations communities initiate change. So this workbook was always intended to be targeted for First Nations communities in Northern Manitoba. We recognize that there's other communities who might be interested in using this workbook. It can be adapted and changed for different communities. But the original intent of this was for specifically for First Nations communities in northern Manitoba. So we recognized when we were developing this workbook that communities, First Nations communities, have strengths, they have programs, they have initiatives, they have resources in place in the community. And it's only through using those strengths that change can take place in a community. They have to be in a place where change is acceptable, where they're ready for change, and making use of those strengths in the community. And this workbook is simply meant to raise awareness of an issue, the issue being HIV and STBBIs, and helping the community to think about and work through a process of considering how change might occur in a community. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's not meant to be the definitive tool. It's meant to help a community address change in a way that is accessible and usable. So I guess we'll wait for questions after, or do you?
Yeah, yeah. I think Linda will do this other presentation, and then we'll have questions. So everyone, get your questions ready. Think about that. If you want to pop any questions into the chat while we do the next presentation, that's great. So move on to the next presentation. And thanks so much, Linda, for an excellent presentation. I know there'll be a lot of good questions. I'm going to present on the next project, which is the Manitoba Community Event-Based STBBI Toolkit Pilot Study. And really the purpose of this presentation today is to stimulate interest in this study and to tell you that it is an implementation science type of project. We want to attract 5 organizations to agree to conduct the pilot study. And the pilot, the actual testing phase will be from May till September for the study. So a little bit about this toolkit. This was a partnership between the Collective Impact Network, 9 Circles, and the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network. So this was funded by REACH as well through the CANFAR initiative, strategic initiatives. So it really came about because a few years ago, there was a realization that community-based testing was something that different organizations were interested in exploring. And so there was a number of events that were held and testing that occurred. And what we learned from that was that it would be really useful to have a workbook or toolkit that went along with that, so that people who wanted to do these kind of events could understand how to go about it, because there's a lot of steps involved. So there's a lot of learnings from these events back in around 2017, 2018. So that we got the funding, and last year we actually the network and 9 Circles engaged with Manitoba Harm Reduction Network to help pull together this toolkit. And some of you may recall that we actually launched the toolkit actually last March, a year ago. So the toolkit was launched, but what we're doing now for this study is we're doing a usability study to actually test out the usability and acceptability of the toolkit and get the feedback. Does it really work? That's really what it's about. So just some highlights in the toolkit itself. It's really we think it's user-friendly, but that's part of the feedback. There's topics in there about testing and why it can be hard to access, how to actually plan a welcoming event, making it safe, fun, and relevant, who you need to engage with a small organizing committee, even how to set up the event, some ideas to think about for setting it up, thinking about jurisdictional and technical issues. And then after the event, how will people get their results? And the way this is set up is that there is a barcode so that people that that are engaged in using this toolkit, the testing results are sent with a barcode to the CADM lab so that we know that it occurred at the testing event. So the pilot testing, our plan here is that we get partner agreements, hopefully by the end of March, beginning of April. There'll be a period of training and bringing together all of the sites that are in the 5 sites that are interested. And we'll talk about walking through the workbook, what's involved. So we'll help out the sites with some of that capacity building. Then hosting the events over the first next few months, and hopefully what we're hoping is that with COVID now changing, as we see, that there can be events. And then we will be setting up an evaluation mechanism that we'll ask you to participate in. We'll be talking to the different groups and probably having some focus groups with the folks that have been involved. And then we'll analyze the results and develop a report, and then look at possibly revising the workbook based on that, and then relaunch the next version of it, or the toolkit, sorry. So that Mike's the sponsor. I'm the project manager for this project. So just a bit more on that. One of the things is that part of this process is to involve peers and peers are involved with at the events, helping people to navigate the testing, etc. And there's different strategies that are embedded in the toolkit itself, and we'll go through that when we're doing the training. And I guess the main thing is that one of the things is we'll work with you with bringing the peers on board. They will be provided a fee for their work. And then the community partners actually will receive a fee that Mike will talk about in a few minutes. So just to highlight the next steps is we want people to apply to us, or organizations to apply. Then if you're accepted in as one of the 5 sites, there'll be a memorandum of agreement with you. Again, the training workshops it will do. Then run the pilot, evaluate as we go, and then develop the report. So I'm hoping that you'll want to get on board, or if you know others that want to get on board, let them know and let us know. I'm going to hand it over to Mike for any additional information he wants to say about the pilot. So Mike.
Sure. If it's possible, Lori, if you could let me be seen, that would be helpful. I'll start talking, but I'm not able to be seen again.
Okay.
So I think just some helpful things for folks to know if you're thinking about, hey, I'm in a community that may be interested in this, or passing the information along to communities who you think would be interested. So it's centered around an event. It's not the interest of the network to have control over that event. So whether a community group or an agency in a community is seeking to initiate some kind of community activity that includes HIV-STBBI testing, or whether there's an interest in simply embedding HIV-STBBI testing into an existing event like a health fair, or a powwow, or something that's already happening. And any of those events are appropriate to the nature of this. Our interest really is offering the toolkit and supporting you to use the toolkits. And really what we're wanting is for you to evaluate the toolkit so that we can know that it's the best tool that it can be. So if that interest is there, what we're able to offer to folks is $5,000 in total for an event to supplement money you already have, or to support the event as a whole. How you spend that money and what the event looks like is really up to you. Here are the key things that we'll be looking for, of course. One is the purpose of the event can be yours, but the purpose of us being involved in the event is really about reaching the undiagnosed. So if the intention or the inclusion into your event is that we are going to find a way to offer STBBI testing to individuals who may not otherwise and have connected with testing. So there's a population that may not have good access, where there may be a lot of folks who could potentially be living with HIV or an STBBI and not yet undiagnosed. You'll want to tell us about that. You want to tell us how this event may do that. It is prioritized, the funding, to prioritize applicants from rural and northern communities, and also applicants who are seeking to reach populations who are kind of traditionally under accessing testing. So folks from who are working with the Indigenous community, the ACB community, or in your neighborhood, maybe that's a different community, you can name it. But just be aware, it's really about reaching the undiagnosed and reaching folks who struggle to connect. So 9 Circles wouldn't be proposing that we want to have an event in our STI clinic where we see people who come in for routine testing, because that's not really the intention of the fund. So just being aware of that. The $5,000 can be spent how you feel it's appropriate to be spent. What we would look for in that submission is obviously that you're going to integrate testing into the event. We may also ask, hey, if you can, we'd love for you to also include an opportunity to promote the HIV-INSTI home test, because it's another project that we have. And so if you can help promote it, that's great, but that's not the expectation. We'll also, of course, want you to participate in evaluation. And so that would be sharing your evaluation of the event that you had. And if you need support in designing that, we can offer some support. But most importantly, we want you to participate in the evaluation of the toolkit itself, as Lori mentioned. Similar to the project that Linda described, we need you to tell us whether this tool is helpful. That's our primary goal. The other thing, of course, we'll look for, which Lori referenced already, is are you actively and meaningfully involving people with lived experience or peers in the work? And if you're doing those things, if you're offering testing, if you're willing and able to participate in the evaluation, and you're including peers, then we're happy to get that submission. Right now, we're looking at about 5 community agencies or groups that we can support with $5,000. We may actually be able to do more than that, but we're going to start with 5 and we're going to grow from there. The only other thing I thought I'd note is Lori mentioned that the barcode that's associated with the testing toolkit. What that will allow for when you're thinking about evaluation, obviously, if I'm organizing an event, I'm not getting test results back from people who got tested. That obviously is going to the provider that's linked to your event. But what you will get back because of that barcode is some information from CADM on the number of people who got tested and a positivity rate, which can be really helpful for you to determine, was this a good event? Was this worth our time? Did we capture people who may not have been caught in other parts of the system before? So that's a great distinct part of this package that I know folks have really appreciated in the past. And the last thing I'll say is it's intended to be easy to access. So when we say you're going to fill out an MOU, it's pretty much just going to articulate what I've already said. There won't be anything significantly complex about it, because we really want this to be something that encourages groups and communities who may not normally be able to do this, to undertake something unique and introduce the concept of testing and support a testing event in their community. The last thing I would say is, when we're thinking about testing, the most often testing methodology, of course, will be a blood draw or phlebotomy, and that's where the CADM lab component comes in. But we also welcome people to think about the range of existing and emerging testing technologies and what might be best for your event. Is point of care testing something you want to look at? Is red blood spot testing something you want to look at? The toolkit will give you a sense of the things that you want, the options you want to explore, and know that all of those options are worth considering when you're designing your event, depending on what you think is best in your community. Is that helpful, Lori?
That's great, Mike. Thanks so much. I'm going to suggest I'll turn off the video now, or the recording, I mean. I'll turn off the recording, because then we can use this to send out to people, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'll stop the recording. And